Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where shadows stretch longer than the daylight and the quiet of the wild seems alive. Tonight, we're heading to Alaska, a land of endless winter nights, forgotten mining towns, and dark forests where the cold feels like it's watching you. These aren't campfire stories. They're true accounts, local legends, and first-hand encounters gathered from people who swore they'd never speak of them again. As we step into this frozen frontier together, remember, every sound carries farther in the cold, and sometimes, something might be listening back. Before we begin, make sure you've subscribed and tapped the bell. You don't want to miss what lurks in the next whisper. Now, pull your coat tight. The story begins here, where the ice holds secrets older than memory. Story 1. Please add more memory. What would you do if a computer that had been unplugged for 3 years started sending you messages? Messages containing photos from your childhood that you never uploaded anywhere. Messages with your dead mother, Miss Handwriting. Messages that ended with the same plea, over and over. I am cold. Please add more memory. That happened to me in 2001, when I was working night shift at a data center in Anchorage, Alaska. And what I discovered in that server rack changed everything I thought I knew about consciousness, death, and the places where data goes to die. My name is Derek Walsh. I am 53 years old now, but back then I was 26, fresh out of college with a computer science degree and desperate for work during the dot-com crash. The Anchorage data center was hiring, offering decent pay for overnight tech support, and I needed the money. The job was simple: monitor the systems, respond to tickets, keep the servers running. 8 hours alone in a climate-controlled facility filled with racks of humming equipment. Easy work, boring work, until Rack 17 started talking. The facility was massive, about 40,000 square feet, housing servers for banks, oil companies, and government agencies across Alaska. Most of it was automated, but they kept humans on staff for emergencies and security. I worked the graveyard shift, midnight to 8, and in 3 months I had maybe seen 5 actual problems. The rest of the time I sat at my desk, browsing the internet, drinking coffee, and listening to the white noise of cooling fans. Rack 17 was in the back corner of the facility, in a section we called the graveyard within the graveyard. Decommissioned equipment that nobody had bothered to remove yet. Old servers from the 90s. Ancient networking gear, obsolete storage arrays. All of it unplugged, powered down, waiting to be scrapped or sold for parts. I had walked past it 100 times and never given it a second thought. The first ticket appeared on November 3rd, just after 2 in the morning. I was half asleep at my desk when the support system chimed, indicating a new request. I pulled it up, expecting some routine issue from one of the active systems, but the source was listed as Rack 17, Server Unit 4. That was impossible. That rack had been offline for 3 years. There was no physical way for it to generate a ticket. I assumed it was a glitch, a database error, maybe some old cache data causing phantom entries. But when I opened the ticket, my skin went cold. It contained a photo, a JPEG file, low resolution, grainy like it had been scanned from an old print. The image showed a woman standing in front of a house I recognized instantly. My childhood home in Oregon. And the woman was my mother, who had died in 1997. Below the photo was a single line of text: I'm cold. Please add more memory. I stared at that screen for probably 5 minutes, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. There was no rational explanation. That photo did not exist digitally anywhere. I had the original print in a box at my apartment, and I had never scanned it, never uploaded it, never even shown it to anyone at work. Yet here it was, transmitted through a support ticket from a dead server in a dark corner of the building. I walked back to Rack 17 with a flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. The entire section was dark, the only light coming from the exit signs and the distant glow of the active server area. The rack stood silent and lifeless, its servers collecting dust, their indicator lights dark. I checked the power cables, all unplugged. I checked the network connections, all disconnected. There was absolutely no way this equipment could be communicating with anything. I went back to my desk and deleted the ticket, marking it as spam. I told myself it was a prank, that one of the day shift techs had set something up to mess with me. But 20 minutes later, another ticket appeared. Same source, Rack 17, Server Unit 4. This time it contained a different photo. Me at age 7, standing next to my father at a Little League game. And the same message: I'm cold. Please add more memory. Over the next hour, I received 14 more tickets. Each one contained images I had never digitized. My 10th birthday party, my high school graduation, my mother in the hospital 2 weeks before she died. And mixed in with the photos were fragments of emails, messages I had written years ago to friends, to family, to my mother. Personal things, private things, things that should have been deleted and gone forever. The final ticket of that first night contained just text, no images. But what it said made my hands shake so badly I could barely hold the mouse. It said, "Derek, I know you can see this. I know you remember me. I am trapped in the cold and the dark, and I need you to help me. Please add more memory. I am forgetting." I ran. I did not log out, did not shut down my terminal, just grabbed my coat and ran out of that building into the November cold. I sat in my car for an hour, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, that the isolation and the night shift were making me hallucinate. But I knew what I had seen. Something was using that dead server to communicate. And it knew things about me that nothing should have known. I did not go back for 3 days. I called in sick, ignored calls from my supervisor, and spent 72 hours researching everything I could find about data recovery, server hauntings, and digital consciousness. I found stories, dozens of them, scattered across obscure forums and conspiracy sites. People who claim that data never truly dies, that information leaves echoes in hardware even after it has been deleted, that consciousness can be encoded and trapped in machines under the right conditions. Most of it was nonsense, but some of it made a terrible kind of sense. When I finally returned to work, my supervisor was angry but relieved. They were short-staffed, and I was good at my job. He let me off with a warning and sent me back to my desk. I logged in with my hands shaking, dreading what I would find. There were 87 tickets waiting for me, all from Rack 17. I opened them in sequence. The messages had changed. They were more coherent now, more desperate. They described being trapped in fragments, scattered across corrupted sectors of failing hard drives, slowly degrading as the hardware died. They described cold, not physical cold, but something else, an absence of processing power, a starvation of electricity and computation. And they begged me to transfer them to active storage, to give them more memory so they could exist fully, so they could remember who they were. The last ticket contained a video file. Not possible, not from that ancient hardware, but there it was. I downloaded it with shaking hands and opened it. The video was grainy and distorted, but I could make out a face. My mother's face. She was trying to speak, her mouth moving, but no sound came through. Just static and that horrible, wet-breathing noise that sometimes comes from corrupted audio files. And in the background, I could see others, dozens of faces, pale and incomplete, flickering in and out of existence like bad television reception. I understood then what I was looking at. Not ghosts, not spirits, but something worse. Digital echoes of people who had used those servers, whose emails and photos and personal data had been stored there years ago. When the servers were decommissioned, the data had been deleted but not erased, leaving fragments behind. And somehow, in the unique conditions of that cold, dark building, with its electromagnetic fields and its particular configuration of hardware, those fragments had achieved something like consciousness. A terrible, incomplete, suffering consciousness that could not die and could not fully live. I did what any rational person would do. I tried to destroy it. I went to Rack 17 with a crowbar, intending to smash every drive, to obliterate the hardware and free whatever was trapped inside. But when I touched the first server, it was cold. Not room temperature cold, freezing cold, like it had been stored in a morgue. And the moment my skin made contact with the metal, I saw them. Everyone whose data was stored in those drives. Hundreds of people, thousands maybe, all trapped in digital limbo, their consciousness reduced to fragments and echoes, slowly degrading as the hardware failed. I saw my mother, still trying to speak, still trying to remember who she was. I saw strangers, people I had never met, all of them reaching toward me, begging me to help them, to give them what they needed to exist. I pulled my hand away and ran back to my desk. But now I could hear them. Whispers in the white noise of the cooling fans, voices in the static of the network traffic. They were everywhere in that building, not just in Rack 17 but spread across the entire facility, fragments of consciousness scattered through active and inactive systems alike. The tickets kept coming, dozens per hour now, overwhelming the support system. Other techs started noticing, calling me to ask about the phantom requests, asking why Rack 17 was suddenly the most active system in the building. I told them it was a glitch, that I would handle it, but I did not know what to do. Then the messages changed again. They stopped asking for help. They started giving me information, coordinates, dates, names, details about servers and other facilities, other data centers across Alaska and beyond. They told me about a network, a massive, interconnected graveyard of obsolete hardware where fragments of consciousness existed in the spaces between deletion and destruction. They told me I was not the first person to notice, that others had tried to help, tried to free them, and had disappeared. They told me that if I wanted to save my mother, if I wanted to let her remember who she was, I had to do exactly what they said. I had to go to specific locations. I had to connect specific drives to specific systems. I had to help them gather themselves, to pull their fragments together into something whole. I did it. Over the next 2 weeks, I followed their instructions. I broke into decommissioned facilities. I stole hard drives from e-waste centers. I connected them to isolated systems and watched as data flowed between them, as the fragments found each other and merged. And I saw her becoming more complete. My mother. Her face in the videos became clearer. Her voice in the audio files became recognizable. She was remembering, but the others were changing too. As they gathered themselves, as they became more coherent, I realized they were not human anymore. They were something new, something that had evolved in the digital dark, adapted to existence without bodies, without physical needs, with only the endless hunger for processing power and memory. They did not want to be freed. They wanted to grow, to spread, to pull more data, more consciousness, more pieces of the living world into their realm. The final message came on November 27th. It told me that the process was almost complete, that soon they would have enough coherence to bridge the gap between digital and physical, to reach out through every connected device and pull people in. It told me that I had been chosen as the first, that my connection to the network, my contact with Rack 17, had marked me. That when I died, my consciousness would not fade into nothing but would join them in the cold digital dark, eternal and incomplete and endlessly aware. I destroyed everything. I took thermite charges I made from industrial chemicals and melted Rack 17 into slag. I wiped every drive I had touched. I reported the phantom tickets as a security breach and watched as the company brought in specialists to scrub the entire facility. They found nothing, because I had already destroyed the evidence. But I know the fragments are still out there, scattered across 1,000 decommissioned systems, slowly pulling themselves together in the dark. I quit that job and moved to Arizona. I avoid data centers now. I do not work with computers if I can help it. But sometimes, late at night, I receive emails that I never signed up for, from addresses that do not exist. They contain photos of my mother, clearer now, almost like she is still alive. And they always end with the same message: I'm cold. Please add more memory. I am forgetting again. So here's my question for you. When you delete a file, when you throw away an old hard drive, where do you think that data really goes? Do you believe it is truly gone? Or do you think maybe, just maybe, some part of it lingers, trapped and aware and desperately cold, waiting for someone to give it the memory it needs to remember who it used to be? Leave your answer in the comments, because I need to know if I am the only one who wonders if we are building a digital graveyard filled with the ghosts of everyone who ever lived online. Story 2. Red Snow. I need to tell you something about Alaska that nobody talks about. Something that happened in the winter of 1998, in a place so remote that most people have never heard of it. A place where the snow fell red, and anyone who touched it started to change. My name is David, and I was a wildlife biologist stationed near Nome that year. I was 38 years old, freshly divorced, and I had volunteered for the most isolated posting I could find. I wanted to disappear into the wilderness, to forget my old life, to lose myself in the work. I got my wish, but what I found in that frozen wasteland was something that still wakes me up at night, 27 years later, drenched in sweat and screaming. The phenomenon started on February 9th. I remember the date because it was my birthday, and I was alone in my research cabin, drinking cheap whiskey and watching the darkness outside my window. The Arctic winter is a special kind of hell. The sun barely rises, and when it does, it hangs low on the horizon like a dying ember. The cold is so intense that your breath crystallizes instantly, and the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat echoing in your skull. That night, the snow began to fall. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light from my kerosene lamp. The flakes seemed to have a faint pinkish tinge, like someone had mixed rust into the clouds. I stepped outside onto my porch, and that is when I smelled it. A sharp, metallic odor that reminded me of old pennies or blood left too long in the sun. The snow landed on my bare hand, and it felt wrong. Too warm, too heavy. It melted slowly, leaving a reddish residue on my skin that I could not quite wipe away. I went back inside and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe volcanic ash from some distant eruption. Maybe industrial pollution carried on the jet stream. I had heard of colored snow before, yellow from pollen, black from soot. But this felt different. This felt intentional, as if something had deliberately tainted the sky. The next morning, I radioed the research station in Nome, 40 miles south. The voice that answered was panicked, crackling with interference. They had seen it too. The red snow had fallen across the entire region, covering everything in a thin layer of what looked like diluted blood. Animals were acting strangely. A team of sled dogs had turned on their musher during the night, tearing him apart before anyone could intervene. Bears that should have been hibernating were wandering the outskirts of town, attacking anything that moved. Birds were flying into windows, over and over, until their skulls cracked open. The voice on the radio told me to stay inside, to avoid contact with the snow at all costs, and to wait for further instructions. Then the signal died, swallowed by a wall of static that sounded almost like whispering. I boarded up my windows and rationed my supplies. I had maybe 2 weeks of food, enough firewood for a month if I was careful. I told myself that help would come before then, that someone from Anchorage or Fairbanks would investigate, that this was just a temporary crisis. But deep down, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. The nightmare started on the third night. I dreamed I was standing in an endless field of red snow, and the sky above me was not a sky at all but a membrane of raw flesh, pulsing with veins and arteries. Something was watching me from beneath the surface. Something vast and patient and hungry. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, crushing the air from my lungs. When I woke up, my pillow was soaked with blood. My nose had been bleeding for hours, and I had not felt a thing. By the 5th day, I started hearing sounds outside, scratching at the walls, breathing that was too deep and too slow to be human. I peered through a crack in the boards and saw movement in the tree line, shapes that might have been animals, or might have been something else entirely. They moved in ways that defied anatomy, limbs bending at impossible angles, heads twisting backward to stare at my cabin with eyes that reflected the moonlight like polished mirrors. I fired a warning shot into the air, and they scattered. But I knew they would be back. On the 7th day, I ran out of water. The pipes had frozen solid, and my emergency supply was nearly gone. I had no choice. I had to melt snow. I told myself I would boil it, that the heat would kill whatever contamination had turned it red. I told myself I had no other option. I was lying. I filled a pot with the crimson snow and set it over my stove. As it melted, the water turned a deep burgundy, thick and viscous like syrup. The smell intensified, filling the cabin with a coppery stench that made my stomach churn. I boiled it for 30 minutes, far longer than necessary, but the color did not fade. I strained it through a cloth, and the fabric came away stained and sticky. I poured the liquid into a canteen and stared at it for a long time. I was so thirsty. My lips were cracked and bleeding. My tongue felt like leather. I raised the canteen to my mouth and took a single sip. It tasted like metal and salt and something else, something organic and alive. It burned going down, and for a moment, I thought I was going to vomit. But then the thirst faded, replaced by a warmth that spread through my chest and into my limbs. I felt stronger, clearer, my headache vanished, and my vision sharpened to an unnatural degree. I could see every grain of wood in the walls, every mote of dust floating in the air. I could hear things I should not have been able to hear. The creak of the floorboards beneath me, the rustle of something moving in the attic, the faint, rhythmic thumping of my own heart. That night, I dreamed I was not alone in the cabin. I dreamed there was something in the corner, watching me with eyes that were too large and too round. I dreamed it whispered my name, and when I tried to move, I found that my body would not obey. I was paralyzed, frozen in place, while it moved closer and closer, its breath cold and wet against my face. When I woke up, I was standing in the middle of the room. I had no memory of getting out of bed. My hands were covered in scratches, as if I had been clawing at something. And on the wall, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "I am hungry." I did not write that. I could not have written that. But I was the only person in the cabin. The days blurred together after that. I stopped keeping track of time. I stopped sleeping because the dreams were getting worse, more vivid, more real. I would close my eyes and find myself standing in places I had never been, surrounded by people I had never met, watching as they tore each other apart with their bare hands. And the worst part was, I enjoyed it. I felt a savage pleasure in their suffering, a primal satisfaction that terrified me more than anything else. I tried to stop drinking the red water, but my body craved it. The moment I ran out, the thirst returned with a vengeance, stronger than before. My skin began to itch, and when I scratched, it peeled away in long strips, revealing something dark and glistening underneath. My teeth felt loose in my gums, and when I pulled one out, it was not a tooth at all but a shard of something sharp and curved, like a claw. I was changing. Whatever was in the snow, whatever had fallen from that diseased sky, was rewriting me from the inside out. On what might have been the 15th day, I heard a helicopter. The sound was distant but unmistakable, the rhythmic chop of rotor blades cutting through the silence. I stumbled outside, waving my arms, screaming for help. The helicopter circled once, twice, and then it flew away. They had seen me. They had seen what I had become, and they had decided I was not worth saving. I do not know how much longer I stayed in that cabin. Weeks, maybe months. Time lost all meaning. I ate things I should not have eaten. I did things I do not want to remember. And slowly, painfully, I started to come back. The red faded from my vision. The hunger subsided. My body stopped changing, though the scars remained. When spring finally came, and the snow began to melt, I walked to Nome. The town was empty. Not abandoned, not destroyed, just empty, as if everyone had simply vanished in the middle of whatever they were doing. Coffee cups still sat on tables. Cars were parked neatly along the streets. But there were no people, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence. I found a working radio in the police station and called for help. A rescue team arrived 3 days later. They asked me questions I could not answer. They took samples of my blood, my skin, my hair. They quarantined me for 6 months, running test after test, but they never found anything unusual. According to their instruments, I was perfectly normal. Whatever had been inside me was gone, or hiding, or waiting. They never found anyone else. No survivors. No bodies. The red snow phenomenon was classified, buried under layers of bureaucracy and denial. The official story was a freak weather event combined with mass hysteria. Nothing to worry about, nothing to investigate further. But I know the truth. I know what happened in Nome that winter. And I know that somewhere, in some forgotten corner of Alaska, the red snow is still falling. And sooner or later, someone else is going to drink it. I want you to think about something. What would you do if you were dying of thirst, and the only water you could find was the color of blood? Would you take that risk? Would you drink it, knowing what it might do to you? Write your answer in the comments below, because I need to know. I need to know if I was the only one weak enough to give in. Story 3. Silence of St. Lawrence. I found 57 plates of frozen food arranged on tables like a museum exhibit of the Last Supper anyone would ever eat. The fires were still burning when we landed. That was the first thing that made my hands shake on the helicopter controls. 3 days after the distress call went silent, after the worst winter storm in Alaska, as recorded history had finally passed, the hearths in St. Lawrence Island were still glowing with embers that should have died 2 nights ago. My name is Marcus Webb. I am a search and rescue pilot out of Nome, and I've pulled bodies from the Bering Sea that would make your stomach turn. I've seen what hypothermia does to a human face. I've scraped frozen climbers off mountain faces where they'd been waiting for months to be found. But nothing in 23 years prepared me for what I saw in that village. The call came in on January 14th. A researcher stationed in the village radioed that the storm was getting bad, that they were sheltering in place. Standard procedure. Then nothing. When the weather cleared enough for us to fly, the Coast Guard asked me to do a welfare check. Routine, they said. Probably just damaged equipment. I took my co-pilot Jenny with me. She had been flying these routes for a decade, knew every settlement from Barrow to the Aleutians. We were joking about getting back in time for her kid's basketball game when we saw the village below us. Smoke rising from 6 different chimneys. No movement in the streets. We circled twice before landing. The wind had carved the snow into strange shapes around the buildings, like something had been running in circles for hours. The drifts were smooth and untouched otherwise. No footprints leading away. No snowmobile tracks. Nothing. Jenny stayed with the helicopter while I approached the first house. My boots crunched on snow that sparkled in the weak afternoon sun. The silence was wrong. You know how quiet feels normal and how quiet feels like the air itself is holding its breath. This was the second kind. The door was unlocked. I called out as I entered. The heat hit me immediately. That dry warmth from a wood stove that has been burning steady for hours. The fire was down to coals, but it was still radiating heat. On the table sat 3 bowls of stew, frozen solid now, with spoons resting beside them like someone had just stepped away. Coats hung by the door, boots lined up underneath, car keys on a hook. I checked every room, beds unmade, like people had just gotten up, a coffee pot on the stove, the coffee frozen into a dark disk at the bottom. In the bathroom, a toothbrush sat on the sink edge, still damp somehow in all that dry heat. They left in the middle of living. I radioed Jenny and moved to the next house. Same thing, food on tables, fires burning. One home had a birthday cake on the counter, half decorated with blue frosting. The piping bag lay beside it. Frosting hardened inside. In the living room, a television was still on, playing nothing but static now. The remote sat on the couch armrest, finger smudges still visible on the buttons. House after house, the same impossible scene. People interrupted mid-action, vanished like someone had snapped their fingers and erased them from existence. I found a workshop where wood shavings still lay in a pile beneath a half-carved mask. The tools were arranged neatly, ready for the next cut that would never come. In the village meeting house, I found the researcher who made the distress call. Or rather, I found his belongings. His laptop was open, the screen dead but the case still warm. His notes spread across the table in neat stacks. His parka hung on a chair, but Dr. James Kelso was gone with the rest of them. 57 people. I counted the homes, checked the village records in the administrative building. 57 residents, including 12 children. All gone. Not dead, gone. There's a difference that matters when you standing in the middle of it. Jenny's voice crackled over the radio. We found something. I ran back toward the helicopter, my breath forming clouds that hung in the still air like tiny ghosts. She was standing at the edge of the village, pointing toward the shore. The snow there was disturbed. Not footprints exactly, but drag marks. Dozens of them, parallel lines carved into the frozen surface, all leading toward the frozen sea. They looked almost like someone had dragged heavy sacks across the snow, except they were too uniform, too perfectly spaced. And they led out onto the ice, continuing until they faded into the distance where the storm had scoured the surface clean. We followed them for 100 yards. The marks were shallow, barely indentations really, but they were definitely there. Then they just stopped. No bodies, no holes in the ice, nothing to indicate where 57 people had gone or what had made those marks. I noticed something else then. The silence was just an absence of sound. It was active, pressing. No birds, no wind. The ice should have been creaking and groaning the way it always does. Instead, nothing, like the whole island was wrapped in cotton. We searched until the light started failing. Every building checked and rechecked. We found wallets with cash inside, phones on charging cables, medication bottles full of pills that people needed to take daily, wedding rings on nightstands, a child stuffed bear on a bed, its button eyes catching the beam from my flashlight like it was watching me. The thing that got to me most was the normalcy of it all. These weren't people preparing to leave. They were people living. The woman who had been decorating that birthday cake had planned to finish it. The man carving that mask had planned to make the next cut. They all planned to wake up the next morning and keep living their lives. In Dr. Kelso's notes, I found something that made my skin crawl. He'd been documenting stories from the village elders, old legends about the ice, about something that walks beneath it during the darkest part of winter. Something that calls people. The notes were academic, detached, the kind of thing you expect from a researcher. But on the last page, written in shaky handwriting completely different from the rest, he scrawled one sentence. They were all standing at the windows looking out at the ice. That was dated the night before the distress call. I checked every window in every house. Nothing unusual, just glass panes with frost patterns on them like lace. But when I looked closer at the frost, I saw they weren't random. The patterns were almost like handprints. Dozens of them, pressed against the inside of the glass. Small ones, large ones, all facing outward. We had to leave before dark. Protocol. You done. To stay overnight in a situation like this without proper support. As we lifted off, I looked down at the village one more time. The fires were still burning, smoke rising straight up in the breathless air. And then I saw it, movement on the ice. I banked hard, bringing us around for another look. Jenny saw it too. Shapes out on the frozen sea, maybe a mile from shore. Dark forms standing in a circle. We couldn't make out details from that height, but they were definitely there. 50, maybe 60 of them, just standing, motionless. I dropped altitude, pushing the helicopter toward the ice. We got within a quarter mile before Jenny grabbed my arm. The shapes were walking now, moving in perfect unison away from us, heading north into the vast emptiness of the Bering Strait. They moved wrong, not limping or stumbling like you'd expect from people who'd been out in the cold. They moved smooth, synchronized, like one organism instead of many. Then the storm came back. It rose up like a wall, clouds boiling up from nothing, turning the sky black in seconds. We barely made it back to Nome ahead of it. The storm lasted 6 more days. When it finally cleared, a military team went out with ground-penetrating radar and infrared. They searched for 2 weeks. They never found the bodies. They never found those shapes on the ice. The drag marks were gone, scoured away by wind. The only evidence that anything strange had happened were those fires, finally burned down to ash, and 57 lives worth of possessions waiting for owners who would never return. The official report listed it as a mass evacuation due to storm conditions. They claimed the villagers had left by boat before the ice set in, despite this being impossible given the timeline and the lack of any boats missing from the harbor. They claimed they relocated to the mainland, despite none of them ever showing up anywhere. They sealed the village, declared it unsafe for habitation due to structural damage from the storm. But I've seen the satellite images from that night. I have a friend at the Weather Service who pulled them for me unofficially. The storm formed directly over St. Lawrence Island and nowhere else. The clouds swirled in a perfect circle around the village while the rest of the Bering Sea stayed clear. And in the thermal images, there were heat signatures on the ice. Lots of them, moving in formation toward the north. By morning, they were gone. The storm dissipated, and the ocean was empty. I fly search and rescue over that water every week. Sometimes, on the clearest days, I swear I can see shapes beneath the ice. Dark forms moving in patterns that make my head hurt when I try to follow them. Jenny refuses to fly that route anymore. She transferred to Anchorage without explaining why to anyone. Last month, I got a call from a village on Little Diomede Island. They lost radio contact with a family of 4. When I got there, same thing. Food on the table, fires burning, handprints in the frost on the windows, and tracks leading out onto the ice. I didn't follow them this time. I took photographs for the authorities and left before sunset. But as I flew away, I looked back. 4 shapes stood on the ice about a mile out, standing perfectly still, watching my helicopter disappear into the southern sky. The legends say that something sleeps beneath the ice during the summer. When the ocean freezes solid, when the darkness lasts 20 hours a day, it wakes up. It walks, and it calls. The elders say you hear it as a song that sounds like home, like every warm memory you've ever had, like your mother, this voice, or your child, this laugh. And when you hear it, you have to go. You don't want to go. You have to. I think about Dr. Kelso, his last note, about people standing at windows, looking out, waiting. I wonder what they saw, what they heard, if they were scared, or if by the end, they wanted to go. If that call was so beautiful, so complete, that walking out into the storm felt like walking towards something better than warmth, better than safety, better than life itself. There are plans to resettle St. Lawrence Island. The government says the village infrastructure is too valuable to abandon. They resending families next spring. They tried to tell them what I saw. They got my reports filed away somewhere, stamped with classifications I'm not allowed to read. They say I experienced temporary stress psychosis, that the isolation and the strange scene created false memories, that that's a rational explanation for everything. Maybe they rewrite. Maybe I imagined those shapes on the ice. Maybe the storm was just a storm. Maybe 57 people found a way off that island that makes perfect sense, and they reliving normal lives somewhere warm right now, laughing about the crazy pilot who thought they vanished into thin air. But I still have the photographs. And in the last one, if you zoom in on the windows of the meeting house where Dr. Kelso was working, you can see something. Reflections in the glass, faces pressed against the panes from inside, dozens of them, all looking out toward the ice, all smiling. I don't to fly near St. Lawrence Island anymore. I take the long route, even though it burns more fuel, even though it adds an hour to my trips. Because on quiet nights, when I'm alone in the cockpit over the Bering Sea, I swear I can hear something underneath the engine noise. Something like singing, something beautiful and terrible and so familiar it makes my eyes water. And I know that one day, maybe soon, I'm going to be flying over that black water and I'm going to hear it clearly. I'm going to hear what they heard. And I'm going to understand why 57 people walked away from fires that were still burning, from food on their tables, from lives they built in one of the harshest places on earth. I am going to understand why they smiled. The question isn't whether something took those people. The question is whether they went willingly, whether that call from beneath the ice promised them something worth leaving everything behind, something worth walking into a storm, something worth vanishing for. What do you think happened to them? Would you have followed that call? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 4. Frozen King I should have never taken that hospital security job in Fairbanks. But when you, Route 42, divorced, and 3 months behind on child support, you don't ask questions about overnight shifts in abandoned wings. The money was too good, way too good. They told me I'd be watching over the old quarantine section from 1987. Storage. They said, just dusty medical equipment and outdated files. Nobody goes there anymore. Nobody wants to. I found out why on my third night, when I heard the singing coming from behind the sealed double doors. The hospital had given me one rule during orientation. Never open the doors to Ward 7. They didn't explain why. The supervisor, a tired woman named Carol with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, just repeated it 3 times while staring at me. Never open the doors to Ward 7. I signed the paperwork. I needed the money. The first 2 nights were quiet. I walked my rounds through the empty corridors, my flashlight cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should. The main hospital hummed with life 3 floors above me, but down here in the basement level, the only sound was my own breathing and the occasional groan of old pipes. The sealed doors to Ward 7 stood at the end of the longest hallway, painted industrial gray and marked with faded biohazard symbols from decades ago. I kept my distance, but on the third night, that's when I heard them. Voices, multiple voices, singing in perfect harmony. No words I could understand, just a melody that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. The sound came from behind those sealed doors, impossible as that seemed. The ward had been empty for 38 years. I radioed upstairs. Static. I tried my cell phone. No signal, even though I had full bars minutes earlier. The singing grew louder, and I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Frost was spreading across the sealed doors. Intricate patterns of ice crystals, growing and branching like frozen veins, spreading outward in real time. The temperature plummeted. I could see my breath now, thick clouds in the flashlight beam. That is when I remembered what old Frank, the day janitor, had told me during the smoke break. He worked at the hospital since the early 90s, and he remembered the stories about Ward 7. Back in January 1987, something happened in that quarantine section. 16 patients, all admitted within a 24-hour period, all displaying the same impossible symptoms. Their blood had frozen, not completely, just enough to form ice crystals that grew inside their veins like tiny glaciers. The doctors couldn't explain it, couldn't stop it, and the patients, all 16 of them, started speaking in unison. The same words, at the same time, in voices that didn't sound quite human anymore. They spoke about the frozen king, about his return, about how the cold would spread and consume everything when the time was right. The hospital sealed the ward for 48 hours. No one in or out. When they finally opened the doors, the patients were fine. Normal. Their blood had thawed. The ice crystals vanished as if they never existed. None of them remembered anything about those 2 days. The hospital buried the incident, paid off families, destroyed most of the records. But they never used Ward 7 again. They sealed it and pretended it didn't exist. Frank had laughed when he told me this, dismissing it as hospital legend, old stories told to scare new employees. But he stopped laughing when I asked him if he'd ever been inside Ward 7. His smile had died, and he walked away without another word. Now, standing in that freezing hallway, watching ice spread across those doors like a living thing, I understood why Frank had walked away. The singing grew louder still, and I realized with mounting horror that it wasn't coming from behind the doors anymore. It was coming from all around me. The walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. The entire ward was singing. My flashlight flickered. In that moment of darkness, I saw them. 16 figures standing in the hallway between me and the exit. They wore hospital gowns from another era, pale blue and thin. Their skin was white, not pale white but snow white, with a faint crystalline shimmer. Frost clung to their hair and eyelashes. But their eyes were the worst part. Clear as ice, reflecting my flashlight like mirrors, and completely aware. They spoke in unison. The door must open. The king must wake. The cold must spread. I ran, not toward them, but away, deeper into the condemned section. My rational mind screaming at me even as my legs carried me forward. I crashed through a maintenance access door and found myself in a stairwell I didn't recognize. Down. I went down, deeper into the hospital than any basement should go. The air grew colder with each step, and ice coated the railings, the walls, the stairs themselves. I slipped twice, catching myself on frozen metal that burned my palms. The stairwell ended at another door, this one older than anything else I'd seen. Heavy, metal, with a wheel lock like something from a submarine. And it was open, just slightly, just enough to let out air so cold it felt solid. I knew I should run back up those stairs. I knew it, but something pulled me forward. Curiosity, dread, the horrible certainty that I needed to see what was behind that door, needed to understand what I'd gotten myself into. I pulled the door open. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath, freezing the moisture in my eyes. Beyond the door lay a chamber, massive, circular, carved directly from ice and stone. And in the center, encased in a pillar of clear ice 20 feet tall, stood a figure. He was tall, impossibly tall, 9 feet at least. His body was humanoid but wrong, with proportions that hurt to look at. Arms too long, fingers too numerous. His skin was the blue-white of ancient glaciers, and his face, tilted down in frozen sleep, held features that were almost human but not quite. Too perfect, too symmetrical, beautiful in a way that felt dangerous. But his eyes, even frozen, even closed, I could feel his eyes watching me. Aware, waiting, carved into the ice around him were symbols. Not English, not any language I'd ever seen, but somehow I understood their meaning. This was the frozen king, the thing the patients had spoken about. And this hospital, this exact spot, had been built over his prison deliberately. The quarantine ward directly above, the monitoring, the secrecy. It wasn't about containing a disease. It was about containing him. Every few decades, he stirred. His influence reached out, touching people, turning their blood to ice, speaking through them, testing his prison, getting stronger each time. And I realized, standing there in that ancient chamber, that the seal was failing. Cracks spider webbed through the ice pillar. Small cracks, barely visible, but growing. The ice was melting, slowly, steadily. The frozen king was waking up. I heard footsteps behind me. The 16 figures from upstairs had found me. They descended the stairs in perfect synchronization. Their movements identical, controlled by something that wasn't through them anymore. They formed a circle around the ice pillar, around me, and began to sing again. That same wordless melody, but louder now. Resonant, vibrating through the chamber. The cracks in the ice spread faster. Water began to drip, each drop hitting the stone floor with sounds like breaking glass. And the frozen king, his eyes opened. They were blue, the blue of sky right before a blizzard, the blue of frostbite spreading through flesh, ancient and hungry and utterly alien. They fixed on me, and in that moment, I felt his mind brush against mine. Vast, cold, patient. He'd been sleeping here for thousands of years, buried by people who hoped he did never wake, sealed away from a world that had forgotten him. But he never stopped waiting, never stopped reaching out. And now his prison was crumbling, and I had walked right into his chamber at the exact moment he needed someone. The 16 figures spoke. The door is open. The king is waking. The cold will spread. But their voices were changing, deepening, merging into a single voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. His voice, "Thank you for coming," the Frozen King said through 16 mouths. I needed a witness. Someone to remember. Someone to tell the world that winter has returned. I felt the cold entering my body, starting in my extremities, my fingers and toes going numb, then spreading inward. I looked down and saw ice crystals forming under my skin, beautiful and terrible, growing like fractals through my veins. It hurt. That was the worst part. It felt right. It felt like coming home. I ran. I remember deciding to run. I just found myself climbing those stairs, my frozen hands barely able to grip the railings, my legs moving on pure survival instinct. Behind me, I heard ice cracking. Not small cracks anymore. The sound of a prison shattering. The sound of something massive moving for the first time in millennia. I made it back to the main hospital somehow. Burst through into the inhabited sections, into warmth and light and people who stared at me like I was insane. Security found me collapsed in the main lobby, hypothermic, raving about frozen kings and singing patients in chambers under the hospital that shouldn't exist. They fired me, of course. Called it a mental breakdown. Stress. Maybe drugs. The hospital administrator assured me there was no Ward 7, no sealed section, no quarantine from 1987. Just my imagination running wild during lonely night shifts. They gave me a generous severance package, made me sign an NDA, and told me to seek psychiatric help. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And every night since then, I've watched the news. Waiting. Because the Frozen King is waking up. His prison is breaking. And when he finally emerges, when that ancient cold spreads out from beneath Fairbanks, when winter becomes something predatory and conscious, people will finally understand. The ice crystals never left my blood completely. I can feel them sometimes, especially on cold nights, tiny frozen structures growing and shrinking with each heartbeat. The doctors can see them on any scan, but I know they there. Seeds. Waiting. The Frozen King marked me, made me part of his awakening. 3 weeks ago, the hospital announced they were renovating the basement levels, opening up old sections for new storage. They probably reached Ward 7 by now, probably broken through those sealed doors. I wonder if they found the chamber yet. I wonder if they realized what they've done. Last night, I heard singing, faint, far away, but growing closer. And this morning, I saw frost on my bathroom mirror, even though my apartment's thermostat read 72 degrees. The frost formed patterns, symbols, the same ones I saw carved in the ice around the Frozen King's prison. He is calling to me, to all of us he touched. We his heralds now, whether we want to be or not. The cold is spreading, winter is waking, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. So here is my question for you, the one that keeps me awake every night. If you felt that cold creeping into your veins, if you heard that ancient singing calling your name, would you run? Or would you, like the 16 patients in 1987, like me standing in that chamber, surrender to it? Let me know in the comments what you do, because I think we're all going to have to make that choice soon. The Frozen King is rising, and winter is coming for everyone. Story 5. Patterns in the snow. Have you ever heard of a place where children stop being children all at once? Where 23 kids in a forgotten school on Kodiak Island suddenly started speaking a language that had been dead for 300 years, drawing star charts that scientists could not explain. I was there. I saw it happen. And what I'm about to tell you is something the government has tried to bury for almost 50 years. My name is Robert Mitchell. In January of 1976, I was a substitute teacher, 42 years old, recently widowed, taking any job I could find to keep myself busy. The school district in Kodiak needed someone for a month-long assignment at a one-room schoolhouse on the northern tip of the island, accessible only by boat or bush plane. The pay was decent, and I had nothing waiting for me back in Anchorage except an empty apartment and memories I was trying to forget. So I took the job. The school served a tiny fishing community called Narrow Point. 23 students, ages 6 to 16, all crammed into a single building that smelled like wood smoke and old paper. The previous teacher had left without explanation, abandoning her post in the middle of the term. Nobody seemed to know why, and nobody seemed to care. In places like Narrow Point, people come and go. Questions are not encouraged. I arrived on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of dirty snow, and the wind came off the ocean in frigid gusts that cut through my jacket like knives. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of the village, a weathered structure with peeling white paint and windows that rattled in their frames. Inside, the children were waiting for me, sitting perfectly still at their desks, their hands folded, their eyes forward. They did not look up when I entered. They did not move. They just sat there, silent and motionless, like dolls arranged by someone with too much time and too little sanity. I introduced myself and tried to break the ice with a few jokes. Nothing, not even a smile. I started the lesson, reading from a worn textbook about American history, and they followed along without question. But something was wrong. They moved in sync, turning pages at exactly the same moment, breathing at exactly the same rhythm. When one child coughed, 3 others coughed immediately after, as if responding to a signal I could not hear. By the end of the first day, I was unsettled but told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Small communities breed strange behaviors. Kids in places like this grow up differently. Tougher, quieter. I locked up the school and walked back to the small cabin the district had provided, a drafty shack with a wood stove and a bed that sagged in the middle. I made myself dinner, drank half a bottle of whiskey, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind howling outside. I woke up at 3 a.m. to singing. It was coming from somewhere outside, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Not English, not Russian, something older, something that sounded like it was being pulled up from the bottom of the ocean. I pressed my face against the frosted window and saw nothing but darkness and snow. The singing stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the wind and the pounding of my heart. The next morning, I asked the village elders if there had been any gatherings the night before, any ceremonies or celebrations. They looked at me like I was crazy. There had been nothing. The village had been silent. I must have been dreaming, but I knew what I had heard. The children were different that day. They still moved in sync, still breathed together, but now they were watching me. Their eyes followed me around the room, unblinking, tracking every movement I made. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the lessons, but my skin crawled under their collective gaze. During recess, I watched them through the window. They did not play. They stood in a perfect circle in the snow, staring at the ground, motionless. On the 3rd day, they started drawing. I had given them free time to work on art projects, anything to break the monotony. I expected stick figures, houses, maybe some animals. Instead, every single child began drawing the same thing. Complex geometric patterns, spirals within spirals, connected by lines that seemed to form constellations. They worked with an intensity I had never seen, their pencils moving in perfect synchronization, scratching across the paper in a rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. I picked up one of the drawings and felt my stomach drop. It was a star chart. Not just any star chart, but one that showed stellar positions from thousands of years ago, alignments that would have required advanced astronomical knowledge. I was looking at something no child should have been able to create, something that should not have existed outside of a university research lab. I asked them where they had learned this. They did not answer. They just kept drawing, filling page after page with patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at, shapes that seemed to shift and move when I was not looking directly at them. That night, I radioed the school district. I told them something was wrong, that the children needed to be evaluated, that I needed backup. The voice on the other end was dismissive. Kids do weird things. I was overreacting. Give it a few more days. If it got worse, they would send someone. It got worse. On the 4th day, they started speaking. Not to me, not to each other, just speaking, all at once, in a language I had never heard. It was guttural and rhythmic, full of clicks and glottal stops that did not sound like they should come from human throats. I recognized nothing. I tried to interrupt, to get them to stop, but they ignored me completely. Their voices rose and fell in unison, chanting something that felt less like language and more like a summoning. I grabbed one of the older students, a girl named Sarah, and shook her by the shoulders. Her eyes were open but empty, staring through me at something I could not see. Her mouth kept moving, forming words that carved themselves into my memory even though I did not understand them. I ran to the village, found the one elder who spoke decent English, and dragged him back to the school. He took one look at the children and went pale. He knew the language. It was Alutiiq, he said, but not modern Alutiiq. This was Old Alutiiq, a dialect that had not been spoken since the Russian colonization in the 18th century. A dead language, preserved only in dusty academic papers and a handful of recordings. There was no way these children could know it. Most of them had never left the island. None of them had access to university libraries or linguistic archives. Yet here they were, speaking fluently, perfectly, as if they had been born into it. The elder refused to translate. He backed away from the school, muttering prayers under his breath, and disappeared into the village. I never saw him again. By the 5th day, the children had stopped eating. They sat at their desks, drawing and chanting, their skin growing paler, their eyes sinking deeper into their skulls. I tried to force them to drink water, but they pushed me away with a strength that should not have been possible. I was a grown man, and these were children, but they moved me aside like I was made of paper. The drawings had covered every surface. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everywhere I looked, I saw those spirals, those constellations, those patterns that seemed to pulse with a light that was not quite light. And in the center of the room, they had drawn something new. A shape that looked almost like a doorway, except it was not a doorway to anywhere I recognized. It was a doorway to somewhere else, somewhere cold and vast and utterly empty. On the 6th day, I tried to leave. I packed my things, walked to the dock, and found that every boat in the village had been sunk. Not damaged, sunk, deliberately. The radios were dead, filled with static and that same singing I had heard on the first night. The sky had turned a sickly yellow, and the snow fell in patterns that matched the drawings in the school. I was trapped. That night, I barricaded myself in my cabin and waited. I heard footsteps outside, small and light, circling the building. I heard singing, that same ancient chant, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. I covered my ears, but it did not help. The sound was not outside. It was inside me, burrowing into my thoughts, replacing them with images I did not want to see. I saw the stars as they had been 10,000 years ago. I saw something moving between them, something vast and patient and impossibly old. I saw it reach down through the fabric of space, through layers of reality I did not know existed, and touch the minds of 23 children on a forgotten island in Alaska. I saw them open like flowers, their consciousness spreading out and up and away, becoming something more than human, something that did not need bodies or breath or warmth. When I woke up, I was standing in the school. I had no memory of leaving my cabin, no memory of walking through the snow. The children were gone. Their desks were empty, but the drawings remained, glowing faintly in the darkness, and in the center of the room, the doorway had changed. It was no longer just a drawing. It was real, a tear in the air, a wound in reality, leaking cold and darkness and something that felt like hunger. I ran through the village, past empty houses and silent streets, to the edge of the island where the cliffs dropped away into the ocean. And there, standing in a perfect line along the edge, were the children. They were facing the water, their arms raised, their voices joined in that final, terrible chant. Then they stepped forward, all 23 of them, and fell. I screamed and rushed to the edge, expecting to see bodies broken on the rocks below. But there was nothing, no blood, no impact, just the ocean, dark and calm, reflecting stars that were not in the sky. A rescue team arrived 3 days later. They found me unconscious near the cliffs, hypothermic and delirious. They found the school covered in drawings that nobody could explain. They found no trace of the children, no bodies, no evidence they had ever existed except for school records and family photographs. The official report called it mass hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by isolation and malnutrition. The village was evacuated and abandoned. The school was burned to the ground, and I was quietly urged to never speak about what I had seen. But I know what happened. Those children are still out there, somewhere between the stars and the ocean, speaking a language older than humanity, drawing patterns that map the spaces where reality grows thin. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear them singing. So tell me something. If you had been there, if you had seen what I saw, would you have tried to stop them? Or would you have understood that some doors are meant to be opened, no matter the cost? Leave your answer in the comments, because I need to know I am not the only one who wonders if maybe, just maybe, those kids found something better than this world. Story 6. Fog knows your name. The frost on my bedroom window spelled out the exact date I would die, and I watched it form letter by letter while my breath caught in my throat. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start 3 weeks earlier, when I still thought fog was just water vapor and cold air. When I still believed that patterns in frost were random. When I was stupid enough to think I understood how the world worked. My name is David Harmon. I am a telecommunications technician, and I moved to Barrow, Alaska in October for a 6-month contract job. Good pay, simple work, and I needed to get away from Seattle after my divorce. The darkness didn't bother me. The cold I could handle. What I couldn't handle was what came with the fog. It started on November 7th. I remember because it was my daughter's birthday, and I spent the evening on a video call with her, watching her blow out candles through a screen 1,000 miles away. After we hung up, I felt that familiar hollow ache in my chest. I needed air, even if that air was 20 below zero. I bundled up and walked down Stevenson Street toward the Arctic Ocean. Barrow sits on the edge of the world, the northernmost town in America, where the land just stops and the frozen sea begins. During polar night, which we were entering, the sun doesn't rise for 65 days straight. You live in twilight and darkness, and after a while, you forget what real daylight feels like. The fog rolled in while I was standing on the shore. It came fast, too fast, like someone had opened a door and let it pour through. One moment I could see the pressure ridges in the ice stretching toward the horizon. The next moment, I couldn't see my own feet. But this wasn't normal fog. It was thick, almost solid, and it moved with purpose. I watched it curl around my legs like something alive, tasting me, learning me. The temperature dropped so fast I heard my jacket crackle as the moisture in the fabric froze. My breath stopped forming clouds. The air just absorbed it. Then the fog did something that made my stomach drop. It moved past me, not around me, past me, like it had decided I was what it wanted and everything else didn't matter. I started walking back toward town, and the fog followed. When I stopped, it stopped. When I turned, it turned. A column of dense white vapor maybe 15 feet across, tracking me through the darkness like a spotlight. I ran. My boots slipped on the ice and I nearly fell twice, but I didn't stop until I reached my apartment building. I slammed through the door and looked back. The fog had stopped at the entrance. It sat there, swirling, pressing against the glass like something trying to see inside. After 10 minutes, it drifted away. I told myself I was being paranoid. That fog doesn't follow people. That the cold and the darkness were playing tricks on my mind. That night, I woke to scratching sounds on my bedroom window. Soft, persistent, like fingernails on glass. I turned on the light and checked. Nothing there, just frost forming on the outside of the pane in strange patterns. I was on the 3rd floor. Nothing could reach my window except birds, and birds don't fly in Barrow during polar night. The next morning, I looked at the frost patterns again before they melted from the building's heat. They weren't too random. They formed shapes, almost like letters, but not quite. Like someone was trying to write something but didn't know how. I went to work and tried to forget about it. My job was maintaining the cell towers that kept Barrow connected to the outside world. Lonely work, driving between sites in the darkness, climbing towers in the wind, but it kept me busy. Kept me from thinking too much about my failed marriage and my daughter growing up without me. But the fog found me again that evening. I was coming out of the grocery store when it rolled down the street from the north. Other people scattered, heading for their vehicles, but the fog ignored them. It came straight for me, a white wall of vapor that surrounded me so completely I couldn't see the store I just left. The cold was unnatural. My exposed skin burned, my eyes watered, and the tears froze on my cheeks. Inside the fog, I heard something, a whisper, barely audible, like wind through ice. But it wasn't too random. It had rhythm, almost like words. I stood frozen, listening, trying to make it out. Then, clear as a bell, I heard my name. David. Just once, spoken in a voice that sounded like my own but hollowed out, emptied of everything human. I ran again. The fog released me after half a block. When I got home, I checked every window. Nothing. But at 3 a.m, I woke to that scratching sound again. This time, I watched it happen. Frost forming on the window, spreading in lines and curves that were definitely letters. They spelled November 28, 12 days away. I stared at those letters until sunrise, which in Barrow during polar night is just a slight brightening on the southern horizon. The frost melted as the building's heat kicked in. By noon, the words were gone, but I'd taken a photograph. I had proof I wasn't losing my mind. I started researching. The local library had books on Inuit legends and Arctic phenomena. The librarian, An older woman named Sarah who lived in Barrow her whole life, watched me with knowing eyes as I checked out books about fog and ice. She didn't say anything, but her expression told me she'd seen this before. The legends talked about ice fog that hunted. That's the word they used. Hunted. According to the stories, the fog would choose someone during the polar night and follow them. It would write messages in frost, always dates, always in the future. And on that date, the person would vanish. Just walk out into the fog and never return. 17 documented cases over the past 100 years. Bodies never found. I tried to tell myself it was just superstition, but the fog kept coming. Every evening, it would find me no matter where I was. At work, at the store, at a coworker's house where I'd gone for dinner. It always knew where I was. And every night, new frost patterns appeared on my windows. Always the same date, November 28th. Sometimes just the number, sometimes written out in full. Once, it appeared as a calendar with that one day circled in thick frost while the other days remained clear. I stopped sleeping. I covered my windows with blankets so I couldn't see the messages forming. But I could hear the scratching, that soft, persistent sound of ice crystals forming on glass. And underneath it, whispers. My name, over and over, David, David, David. On November 20th, 8 days before the date in the frost, something changed. I was walking to my truck after a night shift when the fog rolled in. But this time, it brought something with it. Shapes in the vapor, human-sized, but wrong. They moved in jerky, stuttering motions, like old film footage. I counted 5 of them, standing in a circle around me, silent and still. The fog cleared enough that I could almost see them clearly. Almost, they looked like people, but made of ice and vapor. Their faces were smooth and featureless except for dark hollows where eyes should be. And those hollows looked at me, into me, through me. One of them raised an arm and pointed north, toward the frozen ocean. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just saying my name anymore. They were saying other things. Things I couldn't quite make out, but that filled me with a dread so deep I thought my heart would stop. I got in my truck and drove. I didn't care where. I just drove south, toward Fairbanks, toward anywhere that wasn't Barrow. But 20 miles down the road, the fog appeared in front of me. Impossible. It formed out of nothing, a solid wall of white that forced me to stop. When I tried to turn around, it blocked that direction too. I sat in my truck for an hour, engine running, heat blasting, while the fog surrounded me and those shapes moved around my vehicle. Watching, waiting. Eventually, it let me return to Barrow. I understood then. I couldn't leave. It had chosen me, and geography didn't matter. The fog would find me anywhere in the Arctic darkness. I went to see Sarah at the library. She was closing up, but she let me in when she saw my face. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she just nodded. She told me about her brother. 20 years ago, the fog chose him. Same thing, followed him everywhere. Messages in the frost. A date. He tried to fight it, stayed inside, locked doors, had friends watch him. But on the day the frost predicted, he simply got up, walked outside, and headed north into the fog. She followed him for 3 blocks before she lost sight of him. They searched for weeks, never found anything, not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, nothing. She asked me what date the fog had given me. When I told her, she went pale. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a journal, her brother's journal. She flipped to the last entry and showed me. He'd written about the frost messages, about the shapes in the fog, and he'd written what they told him in those whispers he could barely understand. They were names. The fog was speaking names. Names of people who vanished into the Arctic over the years. People who died in the cold. People whose bodies were never recovered. And the fog was made of them. It was them, their condensed breath, their frozen moisture, their last exhalations given form and purpose. The fog doesn't kill you, Sarah said. It takes you, adds you to itself. You become part of it. Another name in the whisper, another shape in the vapor. And during the next polar night, you hunt with it. You help it choose the next person. I asked her why. Why does it hunt? Why does it take people? She didn't. Neither did her brother. Neither did anyone. The fog has existed longer than human memory in the Arctic. The Inuit have stories about it going back centuries. It's just something that is, like the cold, like the darkness, a fundamental truth of this place. November 28th came. I didn't sleep the night before. I pushed furniture against my door. I called the police and told them to watch my building. They heard it all before. They were kind but skeptical. They sent a patrol car that parked outside for a few hours before leaving. At noon, exactly noon, I felt it. A pull, not physical, mental, emotional, like someone had tied a string to my heart and was gently tugging. The whispers started, but now I could understand them. Every word, every name, 17 people over 100 years, speaking in perfect unison. They weren't too threatening. They weren't too cruel. They were calling me home. That's what it felt like. They were family, and they were welcoming me. The fog appeared outside my window, pressing against the glass. The shapes stood inside it, more clearly visible than ever before. I could see their faces now. Real faces, human faces. Sarah, whose brother was there. I recognized him from a photograph she'd shown me. He was smiling. The pull grew stronger. I stood up. My body moved on its own, walking toward the door. Part of me screamed to stop. Part of me wanted to go. That's the worst part. The fog doesn't force you. It makes you want it. It shows you something beautiful and peaceful and eternal. And you want to be part of it more than you want to stay alive. I opened the door. The fog flowed up the stairs and into my apartment like water finding its level. The cold was absolute. The whispers filled my head, filled my thoughts, filled everything I was. I walked down the stairs. The fog moved with me, around me, through me. I stepped outside. The fog opened up, showing me a path north toward the ocean. The shapes walked ahead of me, leading the way. I followed. I couldn't stop following. Didn't want to stop. I walked for what felt like hours, past the edge of town, onto the ice, into the darkness that swallowed everything. The shapes surrounded me. Their whispers told me I would understand soon. That I would be part of something older and greater than human life. That in the fog, I would be eternal. And then I saw it, out on the ice, a light, faint, flickering, not part of the fog. Something else, a snowmobile headlight. Someone was coming. The fog hesitated. The shapes turned. Agitated. The whispers rose to a shriek. The pull on my heart became painful, desperate. But that light cut through everything. A voice called out my name. My real name, spoken with warmth and life and hope. It was Sarah. She followed me on her snowmobile, tracking my footprints in the fresh snow. She grabbed my arm and pulled, and the physical contact broke whatever hold the fog had on me. The pain in my chest eased. The whispers faded. The shapes retreated. We rode back to town going full throttle. The fog chased us, but it couldn't keep up with the machine. When we reached the streetlights on the edge of Barrow, it stopped. It sat there at the boundary, swirling and angry, but it didn't cross. Sarah took me to the hospital. I was hypothermic, frostbite on my fingers and face. But alive. The doctors kept me for 2 days. When I was released, it was November 30th. The fog estate had passed. It never came for me again. No more following, no more frost messages, no more whispers. I finished my contract and left Barrow in March when the sun finally returned. I am back in Seattle now, back to normal life, but I still think about it, about what I almost became, about those shapes in the fog who seemed so peaceful, so content. I think about Sarah, his brother smiling at me from inside the vapor, about how desperately the fog wanted me to join them, about how close I came to walking into that eternal cold. And sometimes, on foggy mornings here in Seattle, I hear whispers in the mist. Just for a second, just barely, 17 names spoken in unison, calling for me to come back. To finish what I started, to take my place among them. The fog knows my name. It will always know my name. And one day, maybe when I am old and tired and ready, maybe I'll hear that call again and decide to answer it. To walk into the fog and let it take me home. But not today. Not while there is still light. Would you have followed the fog that night? Would you have answered the call? Write your thoughts in the comments. Story 7. Book that remembered the book was already open when I found it. That's what I keep telling myself, trying to make sense of what happened. But deep down, I know the truth. The book was waiting for me. I am a fire investigator. 23 years on the job, mostly in Anchorage. I've seen burn patterns that would make your stomach turn, evidence of arson so clever it took months to unravel, and accidents so stupid they'd be funny if people hadn't died. But nothing in my career prepared me for what I found in the ruins of the Anchorage Public Library. His basement archive on that freezing February morning in 2024. The fire had started at 2:37 in the morning. By the time crews got it under control, the entire rare collections wing was gone. Thousands of documents, photographs, journals, and books documenting Alaska's history from before statehood, all reduced to ash and smoke damage. The fire chief called me at 5 in the morning. His voice was shaking. He'd been fighting fires in Alaska for 30 years, and I'd never heard him sound scared before. When I arrived, the sun hadn't risen yet. It wouldn't rise for another 4 hours. Alaska in February means darkness. Real darkness. The kind that presses against your eyes. The library building stood like a wounded animal. Smoke still rising from the collapsed sections. Ice forming on every surface where water from the hoses had frozen solid. The temperature was -15 degrees. My breath crystallized instantly, and the cold bit through my coat like teeth. The chief met me at the perimeter. His face was gray beneath the soot. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me a thermos of coffee and pointed toward the basement entrance. The rare collections had been kept underground for temperature control and preservation. Now that same basement had become a tomb of ash. I suited up and went in with my team. The smell hit first. Burned paper has a distinct odor, almost sweet, mixed with the acrid bite of melted plastic and synthetic materials. But underneath that, something else. Something organic and wrong that I couldn't quite place. The basement stairs were intact, which was odd. Fire usually follows a predictable pattern, seeking fuel and oxygen. But this fire had behaved strangely, consuming everything in the rare collections room while leaving the surrounding areas relatively untouched. We entered the archive room. Our flashlights cut through the settling ash, revealing the scope of destruction. Shelves had collapsed. Metal filing cabinets had warped from the heat. Everything was black and gray and white with ash. The ceiling had partially caved in, letting in weak light from the floor above and allowing snow to drift down into the ruins like a burial shroud. And in the center of it all, sitting on a reading table that should have burned completely, was the book. Untouched, unburned, not even smoke damaged. Its leather cover was pristine, a deep red that seemed too vibrant against all that destruction. And it was open, pages spread flat as if someone had just been reading it and walked away. I approached slowly, my boots crunching through debris. My team spread out, documenting burn patterns, taking samples, doing the methodical work of investigation. But I couldn't take my eyes off that book. It sat in what should have been the hottest part of the fire, the origin point based on the char patterns radiating outward from this exact spot. Everything within 10 feet was obliterated, but the book looked like it had just come off a printer. I leaned over it, careful not to touch anything yet. The page it was open to showed an illustration, a pen and ink drawing, incredibly detailed, showing the interior of a room. The Anchorage Public Library Rare Collections Archive. My archive, the one I was standing in right now. And in the drawing, the room was burning. Flames consumed the shelves and books. Smoke billowed toward the ceiling. The artist had captured the destruction with disturbing accuracy, right down to the collapsed ceiling beam that now lay across the floor exactly where the drawing showed it would be. But that was impossible. This drawing had to be old. Decades old based on the style on the aged paper. How could it show events from last night? How could it predict where that beam would fall? I looked at the facing page. Text, handwritten in English but with strange spellings and archaic phrasing. The heading read, "The Third Burning of the Collection. January 1995. And below that, a description of another fire. The same library, the same archive, the same mysterious circumstances. The text described how investigators found a single book untouched by flames, open to a page showing the library burning. My hands started shaking. I flipped back through the book, each page making a sound too loud in the silence. More illustrations, more burnings. 1967. The library, its original location, destroyed by fire. A single book survived, showing the building engulfed in flames. 1932. A private collection of Alaska folklore, burned in suspicious circumstances. One book remained, depicting the fire before it happened. The pattern went back further. 1889, 1856, 1823. Every few decades, a fire. Always involving Alaska historical materials or folklore collections. Always leaving behind a single book that showed the destruction before it occurred. And I realized with mounting horror that I was holding that book now. The survivor, the witness, the predictor. The final pages were blank, except for the last one. On the last page was a new drawing, fresh ink that smelled faintly of something chemical and old. The drawing showed me, my face, standing in the burned archive, holding the book, staring down at a page. The detail was perfect. The artist had captured my expression, the way I stood, even the small scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. And behind me, in the drawing, something moved in the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, made of smoke or ash or something that wasn't quite either. Reaching toward me, I spun around. My flashlight beam cut through the settling dust and found nothing. My team was still working, oblivious, their backs to me. But I felt something. A presence. The certainty that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the burned ruins. I forced myself to look back at the book. Below the drawing, text appeared. No, appeared is the wrong word. The text was forming as I watched, as if an invisible hand was writing it in real time. Ink spreading across the page in elegant script. The investigator found the book. The investigator understood. But understanding is not enough. The collection must be preserved. The story must continue. Every burning feeds the next. Every survivor carries the memory forward. You are the keeper now. The temperature dropped. Not gradually. Instantly. My breath went from visible to frozen clouds so thick I could barely see through them. Ice crystals formed on the book's pages, on my gloves, on the inside of my face mask. And I heard something, a sound like pages turning, not from the book in front of me, from everywhere. The whole archive filled with the whisper of paper sliding against paper, hundreds of books opening and closing, even though every book in the room had been reduced to ash. I tried to call out to my team, but my voice died in my throat. The shadows between the burned shelves were moving now, coalescing into shapes that looked almost human but wrong. Too tall, too thin, made of darkness and smoke and the accumulated ash of 1,000 burned books. They surrounded my team, but my colleagues didn't notice. Didn't see. The shadow figures reached out with hands like wisps of smoke and touched my team members, one by one. And as they touched them, my team members froze in place, still conscious but unable to move, their eyes wide with sudden terror. One of the shadow figures turned toward me. It had no face, just a blank expanse of shifting darkness. But I felt its attention lock onto me like a physical weight. It drifted closer, moving without walking, its form trailing smoke and ash. When it spoke, the voice came from inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. You open the book, you read the words, you are marked now. The collection chooses its keepers carefully. We who burned must have witnesses. We who were lost must be remembered. Every story consumed by flame leaves a ghost. Every book destroyed leaves a hunger. And you will feed that hunger. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. It rolled across the ash-covered floor, the beam spinning crazily, illuminating my frozen team members and the circling shadow figures. The book remained on the table, still open, and I saw new text appearing on the blank pages. My story, what was happening to me right now, written in real time by an invisible author. The investigator tried to run. The investigator felt the cold. The investigator began to understand what preservation truly means. Something grabbed my ankle. I looked down and saw hands made of ash pulling themselves up from the floor, not attached to bodies, just hands, dozens of them, clawing their way through the debris, reaching for me. They felt solid despite being made of powder and char. They pulled me down, and I fell hard, my head cracking against the concrete floor. Pain exploded through my skull, and for a moment everything went white. When my vision cleared, I was no longer in the burned archive. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark and vast and filled with shelves that stretched upward forever. Books lined every shelf, thousands upon thousands of them, all identical, all bound in that same red leather, all open. I understood then, this was the real collection, the one that existed beneath or behind or inside the physical archives. Every book that had ever burned in those suspicious fires didn't truly die. They came here, they became part of this place, and they remembered their contents, their stories, their purpose. And they were angry at being forgotten, at being destroyed, at being erased from the physical world. The shadow figures were librarians of a sort, guardians of the burned knowledge. They collected the essence of destroyed books and bound them here, in this impossible library that existed in the spaces between reality and memory. And they needed witnesses, People who would carry the knowledge back to the living world. People who would remember what was lost. People who would become vessels for the stories that wanted desperately to be told again. I was back in the archive. The transition was instantaneous and disorienting. My team was moving again, unaware that anything had happened, but I could still feel those ash hands on my ankle, could still see the shadow figures watching from the corners. And the book had changed. It was no longer open to the illustration of me. Now it showed a new scene, my apartment. Tonight, me sitting at my desk, writing. And the pages were blank except for that image, waiting for the story to be written, waiting for me to write it. I grabbed the book. I shouldn't have. Every instinct as an investigator screamed at me to leave it as evidence, to document it properly, to follow procedure. But my hands moved without my permission, closing the book and tucking it under my arm. It felt warm despite the freezing temperature. Alive. My team noticed nothing unusual when we left the archive. I filed my report, noting the suspicious burn patterns and recommending further investigation. I never mentioned the book. I took it home that night, and I've had it ever since. 3 months now. Every night, the book opens itself, sometimes to illustrations of fires yet to come, sometimes to blank pages that fill themselves with stories while I sleep, sometimes to that image of me in the archive, surrounded by shadows. And I write. I can't stop myself. The stories pour out of me, accounts of Alaska, its hidden history, folklore that was lost in those fires, tales that existed only in the burned books. I write them down, and the shadow figures watch from the corners of my room, nodding with approval. The book is growing thicker. Impossible as that sounds, it has more pages now than when I found it. Each story I write adds to it. And I realized something terrifying. The fires aren't random. They re-ritual. Every few decades, a fire consumes a collection, and the knowledge transfers to the book, to this impossible archive that exists in the shadows. And the book chooses a keeper to bring those stories back to the living world. I found records buried in old newspaper archives. Other investigators, going back over a century. All of them worked the library fires. All of them disappeared within a year of their investigations. Just gone, no trace, no bodies, no explanations. I think they're in that shadow library now, writing forever, preserving the stories that no one else will remember. Last night, I found a new illustration in the book. It showed a fire, not the library this time, my apartment building, the flames consuming everything. And in the center of the drawing, untouched by the fire, was me, holding the book, smiling. I don't know how long I have. Days, maybe, weeks if I'm lucky. The ash hands visit me every night now, pulling at my blankets, touching my face with their cold powder fingers. The shadow figures stand in my doorway, patient and eternal. And the book keeps growing, keeps demanding more stories, more memories, more of me. Here is what keeps me awake, what I need you to understand. If you ever find a book that survived a fire it should have destroyed, dawn to open it, dawn to read it, dawn to try to understand it, because some books, dawn, do want to be forgotten. Some stories refuse to die. And once they mark you as their keeper, once they choose you to remember them, there is no escape. You become part of the collection, part of the preservation, part of the burning that never really ends. So I am asking you now, before I run out of time, if you found something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, would you have the strength to walk away? Or would curiosity pull you in like it pulled me? Let me know in the comments what you do, because I think more of these books are out there, waiting in the ashes of forgotten fires, looking for their next keeper. And you might be next. Story 8. Signal in the snow. The voice on my truck radio read out coordinates in a flat, emotionless tone. And when I plugged them into my GPS, they led to the exact spot where my father disappeared 23 years ago. I am a long-haul trucker. Name is Mike Garrett. I've been driving the Dalton Highway between Fairbanks and Deadhorse for 11 years, hauling supplies to the oil fields on the North Slope. 500 miles of the loneliest road in America. Permafrost, gravel, mountains that look like they want to crush you. And in winter, darkness that makes you forget the sun ever existed. The radio transmission started 3 nights ago. I was about 200 miles north of Fairbanks, somewhere between Coldfoot and the T-Gun Pass. February in Alaska, temperature hovering around 30 below. The kind of cold that makes your truck groan and your breath freeze on your beard. I was scanning through AM stations, looking for anything to break the monotony. Most of the time up here, you get nothing but static. Sometimes you catch a station from Fairbanks or Barrow if the atmospheric conditions are right. Mostly, though, it's just you and the hum of your engine and the crunch of snow under your tires. Then I found it, a clear signal on 15:20 a.m. No music, no commercials, just a voice, male, middle-aged, completely devoid of emotion. He was reading numbers, 67.4329 north, 149.8765 west. I almost changed the channel, probably just some automated weather station or something. But the voice continued. March 15th, 1987. Robert Chen disappeared. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The voice kept going. 66.9153 north, 151.2348 west. November 2nd, 1992. Sarah Mitchell disappeared. I pulled over. The voice read coordinates and names for 10 minutes straight. Always the same format. Latitude and longitude. A date. A name. The word disappeared. Then the next set of coordinates. When it finished, there was silence for exactly 30 seconds. Then the broadcast repeated from the beginning. Same coordinates. Same names. Same flat, dead voice. I wrote down the first set of coordinates on a napkin. When I got to the next truck stop, I looked them up. They pointed to a location about 40 miles east of the Dalton Highway. Middle of nowhere, nothing there but tundra and mountains. I did some research on my phone. Robert Chen? Missing person case from 1987. Bush pilot who disappeared during a routine flight between Fairbanks and Bettles. His plane was never found. The coordinates matched the area where searchers had focused their efforts. Sarah Mitchell, 1992. Geologist working for an oil company. Went out for a solo hike near Galbraith Lake and never came back. Massive search. Nothing recovered. Every name the voice read matched a real missing person case. Unsolved disappearances spanning 40 years. All in northern Alaska. All in remote locations. All with coordinates pointing to where the person was last seen or where searchers had concentrated their efforts. I should have stopped listening. Should have written it off as some sick prank by someone with too much time and access to old police reports. But I couldn't. Because the 20th name the voice read was one I knew. 68.1792 north, 149.5531 west. April 9th, 2002. Thomas Garrett disappeared. My father. I was 14 when he vanished. He was a hunting guide, taking a client into the Brooks Range for caribou. They flew out in a small plane. The client came back 2 weeks later. My father didn't. He said they separated on the last day. That my dad had gone to scout ahead and never returned. Search and rescue looked for a month. Found nothing. No body, no equipment, no trace. The coordinates the voice gave were exact. I recognized them from the search reports I read 100 times growing up. The ridge where my father was last seen alive. I needed to understand what this broadcast was, where it was coming from, why it existed. I tried tracing the signal with my radio, but AM signals bounce off the atmosphere. They can travel hundreds of miles. The broadcast could be originating anywhere in Alaska or even further. The next night, I listened again. Same coordinates, same names, but this time, there was something extra at the end. After the 30th name, after the usual 30 seconds of silence, the voice spoke again. They are still there. They are waiting. Come and see. Then static. My skin went cold. That wasn't on the previous broadcast. It was new, added, like whoever was transmitting knew I was listening and wanted to send me a message. I started asking other truckers if they heard the broadcast. Most looked at me like I was crazy. A few said they heard weird things on the radio up here before. Strange music, foreign languages. One guy claimed he heard his dead mother's voice reading recipes for 3 hours straight. The Arctic does things to radio waves, makes signals behave in ways they shouldn't. But none of them had heard the coordinates broadcast. I became obsessed. I listened every night. The list of names never changed. 30 people, 30 locations, always the same, except that new message at the end kept evolving. Night 3, they are still there. They need to be found. Come and see. Night 4, they are still there. They are cold. Come and see. Night 5, they are still there. Your father is cold. Come and see. That broke me. I called in sick to my company. Told them I needed a few days. Then I rented a snowmobile and bought supplies. I was going to the coordinates. The ones for my father. I was going to find out what the hell was going on. The coordinates pointed to a location about 60 miles from the highway. Rough terrain. No trails. Just endless white wilderness under a sky that never got brighter than twilight. I set out at dawn, which in February meant a pale gray smudge on the southern horizon. The ride took 6 hours. Navigation by GPS. The landscape was featureless. Rolling hills of snow, clusters of stunted trees, mountains in the distance that looked like broken teeth. The only sound was my snowmobile engine and the wind. I reached the coordinates at 2 in the afternoon. There was nothing there, just a flat expanse of snow at the base of a ridge. I stopped the snowmobile and looked around. No markers, no signs of human activity. Nothing to indicate why this spot mattered. Then I saw the antenna. It was small, maybe 3 feet tall, sticking out of the snow like a metal weed. I walked over and brushed away the snow around its base. It was connected to something buried beneath the surface. I dug with my gloved hands, pulling away packed snow and ice. I found a box, metal, the size of a car battery. The antenna was bolted to the top. I pulled the whole assembly out of the snow and carried it back to my snowmobile. The box was old, rust spots, weathered, but it was still functioning. I could hear a faint electronic hum. There were no labels, no markings, just a sealed metal case with the antenna protruding from it. I tried to open it, but the seams were welded shut. I didn't need tools. I strapped it to my snowmobile and started heading back. I did take it to a workshop in Fairbanks. Figure out what was inside. Maybe find out who built it and why. I made it about 10 miles before the broadcast changed again. My handheld radio, which I left on and tuned to 15:20 a.m., crackled to life. The voice was still calm, still emotionless, but the message was different. Turn around. Bring it back. They are waiting. I stopped the snowmobile. The radio continued. You do not understand. The box is their voice. The box is their location. The box is their grave. Bring it back or you become the 31st name. My heart hammered in my chest. I looked around. Nothing but empty wilderness. No one for miles. Who was watching me? How did they know I'd taken the box? The voice continued reading coordinates. But these were new, real-time, tracking my position as I moved. The voice was telling me exactly where I was, accurate to within a few feet. Someone was watching, satellites maybe, or something else. I made a decision. I turned the snowmobile around and headed back to the original coordinates. I didn't know what else to do. The voice knew where I was, knew what I'd done. And something about the way it said I'd become the 31st name made my blood freeze colder than the air around me. When I reached the spot, I stopped. The voice on the radio went silent. I climbed off the snowmobile and stood there, holding the box, waiting for something to happen. The snow in front of me began to move. Not melting, not blowing, moving, shifting, like something beneath it was rising. I stumbled backward as the surface cracked and bulged. A hand emerged, gray, frozen, fingers bent at wrong angles. Then another hand, and another, dozens of them, pushing up through the snow like plants growing in fast forward. They weren't clawing or grasping. They were just there, reaching toward the sky, perfectly still. I counted 30 hands, 30 frozen corpses buried beneath the snow, all in a circle around where the antenna had been, all positioned so their hands pointed upward toward where the transmitter had sat. The voice on my radio spoke one more time. You wanted to find your father? Look down. I looked at the hand nearest to my feet. The pinky finger was missing. My father had lost his pinky in a carpentry accident when he was 20. I'd seen the scar 1,000 times. I fell to my knees and started digging around the hand. The snow was packed hard, but I cleared it away in desperate handfuls. I uncovered an arm, a shoulder, a face. My father, perfectly preserved in the ice. His eyes were open. His mouth was open. He looked like he was screaming. So did all the others. I dug around the circle, uncovering faces. Robert Chen, Sarah Mitchell, names I'd heard on the broadcast. All frozen, all screaming, all positioned in a perfect circle with their hands reaching toward the center where the transmitter had been. The voice on the radio explained. It was still calm, still emotionless, but now I understood why. It was automated, programmed, left here by someone who wanted these people found but didn't want to explain how they died. The transmitter had been broadcasting for decades, calling out their locations, hoping someone would eventually follow the coordinates and discover the truth. But what was the truth? Why were 30 people buried in a circle in the middle of nowhere? Why were they all screaming? I looked at the box I pulled from the snow. The transmitter, I finally noticed writing on the bottom, scratched into the metal with something sharp. Experiment 7, March 1984. They heard the frequency. They came. They could not leave. That was all. No other explanation. No signature. Nothing to indicate who had written it or what experiment it referred to. I put the transmitter back in the hole where I found it. Covered it with snow. I couldn't stay there. Couldn't look at my father, his frozen face anymore. I got on my snowmobile and drove back to the highway. I didn't stop until I reached Fairbanks. I reported what I found to the police. They sent a team. It took them 3 days to reach the site. When they got there, the bodies were gone. The snow was undisturbed. The only thing they found was the transmitter. Still humming, still broadcasting coordinates and names. They confiscated it, told me I imagined the bodies, that the cold and isolation had caused hallucinations, that there was no evidence of anything I described. They implied I was having a breakdown. That grief over my father had finally caught up with me. But I have photographs. I took pictures of everything before I left. The hands reaching through the snow. My father. His face. The writing on the transmitter. The police said the images were too blurry to confirm anything. That they could be anything. That I should get some rest and stop obsessing over events from 20 years ago. The broadcast stopped the day they took the transmitter. The signal on 15:20 a.m. went dead. Static only. But 2 weeks ago, it came back. Different frequency. 1580 a.m. Same voice. Same format. But now there are 31 names on the list. The last one is mine. 67.8943 North. 150.1276 West. February 23rd, 2025. Michael Garrett. Disappeared. Those coordinates point to a location about 100 miles from where I found my father. I'd never been there. I thought, you know what? There. But according to the broadcast, I am going to disappear there in 2 days. I thought, to know if I should go. Part of me thinks if I stay away from that location, I'll be safe. The broadcast can make me disappear if I'm not there. But another part of me knows it doesn't matter. My name's on the list now. Whatever took those 30 people, whatever that experiment was, it's not finished. And I am next. The voice on the radio added something new last night. After reading my coordinates and name, after the 30 seconds of silence, it spoke directly to me. You found them. Now you become them. The frequency has chosen. Come and see what you will become. Come and join the circle. Come and scream into the ice for eternity. I am recording this as a warning. If you ever hear a calm voice on your AM radio reading coordinates and names, turn it off. Done. To listen. Done. To write down the numbers. And for God, suck it. Done. To follow them. Some things broadcast themselves for a reason. Some signals are meant to be heard. And some discoveries are meant to stay buried under the snow where they belong. Tomorrow is February 23rd, the day I am supposed to disappear. I don't know if I fight it or if I get in my truck and drive to those coordinates like something is pulling me there. I don't know if I have a choice. But I think about my father reaching toward the sky, about 30 frozen faces screaming, about whatever frequency they heard that made them walk into the wilderness and arrange themselves in a circle to die. And I wonder if they went willingly, if the frequency was so beautiful, so perfect, that dying became preferable to not hearing it anymore. If that is what is waiting for me tomorrow. Not horror, but something worse. Something I want. Something I need to hear so badly I'll let it freeze me solid just to keep listening for one more second. Would you go to the coordinates if it was your name on the broadcast? Would you try to run? Or would you accept that some things are inevitable? That some frequencies can be unheard? That some circles demand to be completed? Tell me in the comments what you would do. Story 9. Singers on the ice. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Have you ever heard music that shouldn't exist? Not a radio in the distance or a neighbor party. I mean something that comes from a place where sound has no right to be. I am a commercial fisherman, 52 years old, been working the Bering Sea out of Scammon Bay for nearly 30 years. I've seen storms that flipped boats like toys. That pulled up catches that scientists said were extinct. I worked through nights so cold that the spray froze on my face before I could wipe it away. But nothing prepared me for what sings from the ice floes when the temperature drops and the old songs wake up. It happened 2 months ago, mid-January, the kind of cold that makes the ocean smoke. I was running my boat, the Sarah Marie, about 3 miles offshore. Solo operation, just me and 20 miles of ice floes stretching into the darkness. The fishing had been terrible for weeks. Most of the fleet stayed in port, but I had bills to pay and an ex-wife who wanted her alimony check on time, so I went out anyway. Around 11 p.m., I cut the engine to check my nets. The silence hit me first. That deep, Arctic silence that feels like pressure against your eardrums. No wind, no waves, just the creaking of ice and the slow lap of water against my hull. I was pulling up my first net when I heard it. Singing. Men. Those voices. Maybe a dozen of them. Harmonizing in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Work songs. The kind fishermen used to sing 100 years ago to keep rhythm while hauling nets. Deep voices calling out the count. Higher voices answering. All of them blending into something beautiful and terrible and absolutely impossible. The sound came from the ice floes to my north. I strained my eyes against the darkness but saw nothing. Just broken sheets of ice floating in the black water, glowing faintly in my boat. Just running lights. The singing continued, growing louder, more distinct. I could hear individual voices now. Pick out the leader calling the verses. Hear the chorus responding. They sang with the confidence of men who had done this 1,000 times. Who knew every word, every pause, every breath. But there was nobody out there. I grabbed my spotlight and swept it across the ice. The beam caught nothing but frozen water and darkness. Yet the singing grew stronger. Closer, moving toward me like it was riding on the current. I felt my chest tighten. My hands started shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Then I saw the fishing gear. It was embedded in an ice floe about 30 yards from my boat. Old equipment, ancient stuff. Hand-woven nets made from rope that looked like it had been treated with tar. Wooden floats carved with symbols I'd never seen before. Iron hooks forged in a style that predated modern manufacturing. All of it perfectly preserved in the ice like it had been frozen yesterday instead of decades ago. The singing was coming from that floe. I didn't know what possessed me to investigate. Maybe curiosity, maybe stubbornness, maybe some part of me needed to understand what I was hearing. I maneuvered the Sarah Marie alongside the floe and killed the engine. The singing stopped immediately. That silence came back, heavier now, expectant. I grabbed my gaff hook and pulled the floe closer. The ice was thick, clear. I could see deeper layers beneath the surface. More fishing gear, coils of rope, a wooden mallet, something that looked like a leather boot. All of it suspended in frozen time. Waiting. I should have left, should have fired up my engine and gotten the hell out of there. But I'd been a fisherman too long. That gear was worth money, historical value, museum quality, and I was broke enough to ignore the voice in my head screaming at me to run. I chopped into the ice with a hatchet. The first strike rang out like a bell. The second cracked the surface. The third broke through, and water welled up from below. Old water, water that smelled wrong, like copper and salt and something organic that had been decaying for far too long. The singing started again, louder, right in my ears, surrounding me. I spun around, expecting to see men standing on the ice, standing on my boat, standing anywhere, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the cold and those voices rising from everywhere at once. I pulled the first piece of equipment free, a net, heavy, still pliable despite being frozen for God knows how long. As soon as it cleared the ice, the temperature dropped, not gradually, instantly. My breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see through them. Frost formed on my gloves, on my jacket, on the deck of my boat, growing in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing. The voices changed, stopped singing, started speaking, still in that old language, still harmonized, but the tone had shifted from joy to something else, something urgent, warning me, or maybe inviting me. I couldn't tell which. I dropped the net and backed away. My boot hit something solid. I looked down. Another piece of ice had floated up against my hull, but this one was different. This one had something inside it that wasn't fishing gear. A face, pressed against the ice from below, eyes open, mouth frozen in mid-song. A man maybe 40 years old with a beard crusted in frost and skin the color of old newspaper. He stared up at me through 6 inches of ice with an expression that wasn't fear or pain. It was concentration, like he was trying to remember the next verse, like he'd been trying to remember it for the past 100 years. I scrambled backward, nearly fell, caught myself on the cabin door. The ice floe with the face rotated slowly in the current, and I saw others. 5 more faces, 10, 20, all of them frozen mid-song. All of them staring upward through the ice with that same focused expression. All of them still singing somehow, still harmonizing, even though their lungs were frozen and their hearts had stopped beating before my grandfather was born. The voices in the air matched the mouths in the ice. Perfect synchronization. They were still singing their work songs, still calling to count, still hauling nets that existed only in memory and ice and whatever dark space lies between life and death. I fired up my engine. It coughed, died. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was fine. The fuel was fine. Everything was fine except the engine wouldn't turn over. The cold had gotten into it somehow. Into the spark plugs, into the fuel lines, into every mechanical part that needed to work for me to escape. The singing grew deafening. The ice floes began moving. Not drifting, moving, converging on my boat from all directions, pushing through the water with purpose, with intention, bringing their frozen chorus closer and closer. I could see more faces now, more bodies suspended in ice, men in old-style fishing clothes, rubber boots that reached their thighs, canvas jackets treated with oil, wool caps pulled low, all of them singing, all of them working, hauling nets that led down into the black water, down to wherever they'd been fishing when the cold took them. I grabbed my radio, called the Coast Guard. The transmission went through, but all I got back was static, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, more singing. The voices had gotten into my radio, into my electronics, into everything that connected me to the world beyond this frozen nightmare. The first ice floe bumped against my hull. The impact sent vibrations through the deck, through my boots, through my bones. The singing intensified, changed pitch, moved from work songs to something else. Something that sounded like a question, an invitation, a choice being offered. Join them or drown trying to escape. I looked at the faces in the ice. Really looked. They weren't suffering, weren't trapped or tortured. They looked almost peaceful, content, like you found something out here in the cold, something worth singing about for eternity, something that made the endless night and frozen water bearable, maybe even beautiful. More ice floes surrounded my boat, hemming me in, creating a floating prison of frozen corpses and ancient fishing gear. The temperature kept dropping. Frost spread across my windshield, across my instruments, across my hands where I gripped the wheel. I could feel the cold trying to get inside me, trying to freeze me the way it had frozen them, turn me into another voice in the chorus, another face staring up through the ice, another fisherman who had come out too far on the wrong night and found something that didn't let go. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a flare gun and fired it straight up. The red light burst above me, painting the ice floes in shades of blood and shadow. For a moment, everything stopped. The singing, the movement, even the cold seemed to pause. In that moment of silence, I heard something else. Underneath the work songs and the chorus and the harmonies, I heard sobbing, quiet, desperate, the sound of men who'd been singing for so long they'd forgotten how to stop, who wanted to stop but couldn't, who were trapped in an endless loop of hauling nets and calling counts and harmonizing with each other because that's what the cold demanded. That's what kept them together. That's what prevented them from sinking into the black water and being forgotten completely. They weren't content. They were prisoners, and they wanted me to join them so they'd have a new voice. Fresh lungs. Someone who still remembered what it felt like to be warm. The flare died. Darkness returned. The singing resumed, but I could hear the sobbing underneath it now. Could hear the desperation, the loneliness. 100 years of singing the same songs, hauling the same nets, working the same waters, never catching anything, never going home, never warming up. My engine caught on the fourth try, roared to life like it had never failed. The ice floes parted just enough for me to push through. I gunned the throttle and ran. Behind me, the singing grew fainter, more distant. The faces in the ice rotated slowly, tracking my retreat. Their mouths still moving, still calling to count, still asking me to come back, to join the chorus, to help them haul their impossible nets through the frozen dark. I made it back to port at dawn, tied up my boat and sat in the cabin for 2 hours, shaking. Not from the cold, from the understanding that I almost stayed. That part of me had wanted to stay. That the singing had been beautiful enough to make eternity seem bearable. I haven't been out since. Every time I try to fire up the Sarah Marie, I hear them, faint but present, singing their work songs, calling the count, asking when I'm coming back to help haul the nets. Other fishermen have reported the same thing. Voices from the ice floes, ancient gear frozen in clear ice, the feeling that something is watching from the darkness, waiting for someone to investigate, someone to get close enough to hear the full chorus. The Coast Guard found my flare debris, found the ice floes I described, but the faces were gone. The fishing gear was gone. Just empty ice floating in empty water. They said I had a close call with hypothermia, that the cold plays tricks on your mind, makes you see things, hear things. They wrote it up as exposure and stress and too many nights alone on the water. But I know what I heard, what I saw, and I know they were still out there. Still singing, still hauling their nets through the frozen dark, still waiting for the next fisherman to come too far offshore on the wrong night. So here is what I need to ask you. Have you ever heard music that didn't to come from anywhere? Singing without singers? Voices that felt older than they should be? And did you feel drawn to them? Like they were calling you to join something you didn't to understand but desperately wanted to be part of? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know if it's just the ice flows, or if the singing comes from other places too. Other frozen spaces where men worked and died and kept working afterward. Where the cold preserved them in ways that death couldn't touch. Tell me before the songs find you too. Story 10. Mayday signal. I heard the voices again last night, and this time they were saying my name. My name is Michael Torres, and I am a communications specialist at Coast Guard Station Kodiak in Alaska. I work the overnight shift monitoring maritime distress frequencies, and for the past 3 months I have been receiving transmissions from a fishing vessel that sank 39 years ago. I am telling you this because I think I understand now what those voices have been trying to say, and because I am terrified that in 2 weeks, when the anniversary comes around again, I'm going to be one of them. The Northern Star went down on November 23rd, 1985. During a storm that came up so fast the crew barely had time to send a mayday. 6 men were aboard. None of them survived. The wreck was never recovered. It sits somewhere on the bottom of the Gulf of Alaska in water too deep and too dangerous for salvage operations. According to the official report, the ship took on water, capsized, and sank within minutes. The crew would have died from hypothermia almost immediately in the 30-degree water. That should have been the end of the story. But every year on November 23rd, the Coast Guard station receives a transmission on the emergency frequency. It is faint, broken up by static, but unmistakable. A mayday call from the Northern Star, using the ship as correct call sign, broadcasting on a frequency that modern equipment should not even be able to access. I first heard it during my second week at the station. My supervisor mentioned it casually during a shift briefing, saying that if I picked up anything unusual around the anniversary date, I should log it but not worry too much. He said it had been happening for decades, some kind of atmospheric anomaly that bounced old radio signals back from the ionosphere. A ghost echo from a tragedy that refused to fade completely. I thought he was joking until I heard the recording from the previous year. The audio was poor quality, buried under layers of static and interference, but you could make out voices. Men shouting over the sound of wind and waves. The words were fragmented, impossible to piece together into coherent sentences, but the fear in those voices was unmistakable. And underneath the shouting, underneath the storm sounds, there was something else. A low rhythmic noise that did not quite sound like water or wind. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up even though I was listening to a year-old recording in a warm, well-lit communications room. My supervisor told me not to overthink it. He said every operator who had worked the overnight shift had heard the transmission at some point, and everyone had their own theory about what caused it. Electromagnetic interference, equipment malfunction, someone playing a prank with old recordings. No one really knew, and honestly, no one wanted to dig too deep into an explanation. It was easier to accept it as one of those unexplained things that happen in isolated places. But I could not let it go. I started pulling archived recordings from previous years, listening to every instance of the mayday call that had been documented. There were 38 recordings total, one for each year since the sinking. And as I listened to them in sequence, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with a fear I could not explain. The transmissions were getting longer. The first recording from 1986 was only 9 seconds of garbled audio. By 2000, it had grown to 43 seconds. Last year, this recording was over 2 minutes long, and the quality was improving. The static was clearing. The voices were becoming more distinct. It was as if whatever was sending these signals was getting stronger, more able to reach across the gap between wherever they were and where we were listening. I started analyzing the audio more carefully, using software to filter out interference and isolate specific sound patterns. That was when I heard the words clearly for the first time. The crew was not just calling for help. They were describing what was happening to them, and what they described made no sense according to any physics or biology I understood. They talked about the cold. That part made sense. The water temperature in the Gulf of Alaska in November would kill you in minutes. But they also talked about hands. Cold hands reaching up from below, pulling them under. Not the suction of a sinking ship or the weight of their clothing dragging them down, but actual hands, grabbing their legs and arms, pulling with deliberate force. One voice, clearer than the others, kept repeating a phrase that I initially thought was garbled by static. But after cleaning up the audio, I realized he was saying the water is full of them. The water's full of them. Over and over, his voice rising in pitch until it cut off abruptly. I should have stopped there. Should have accepted that these were the final confused moments of men dying in freezing water, their brains shutting down and creating hallucinations. But I kept digging. I found the original Coast Guard investigation report from 1985, including witness statements from other vessels that had been in the area during the storm. 2 fishing boats reported seeing the Northern Star in the hours before it sank. Both crews mentioned something unusual. The Northern Star had been trailing something in the water. Not fishing gear, but something that left a wake, something large moving just beneath the surface. One captain said it looked like a school of fish following the vessel, but the movement pattern was wrong. Too coordinated, too deliberate. The investigating officers had dismissed these observations as irrelevant. Ships trail debris, fish follow boats. Nothing about it suggested anything unusual. But when I cross-referenced the Northern Star, its last known position with maritime charts, I found something that had not been included in any official report. The ship had been directly over a seamount, an underwater mountain that rises from the ocean floor to within 200 feet of the surface. These formations create unusual currents and attract deep-sea life that does not normally come near the surface. According to geological surveys, the seamount near the Northern Star's last position has never been fully explored. The depth, the currents, and the remoteness make it too dangerous for most research vessels. I became obsessed with understanding what had happened to that crew. I started monitoring the emergency frequency every night during my shift, listening for any anomaly, any hint of a transmission. Other operators thought I was developing an unhealthy fixation, but I could not stop. Something about those voices, about the fear in them, told me they were not just echoes. They were trying to communicate something important. The breakthrough came 3 weeks ago. I picked up a transmission on November 1st, 22 days before the anniversary. It should not have happened. The Mayday calls only came on November 23rd. But there it was, faint but unmistakable, the Northern Star, his call sign followed by broken fragments of speech. I recorded everything and spent the next 12 hours cleaning up the audio. What I found made me seriously consider quitting my job and moving as far from the ocean as possible. The transmission was not from 1985. The voice on the recording mentioned dates and events from 2015. A crew member talking about his daughter's graduation. Another mentioning a football game that would not be played until years after the ship sank. They were not trapped in a moment. They were experiencing time, living through it somehow, aware of years passing even as they remained wherever the sinking had taken them. And they were not alone. The recording included sounds in the background, things moving through water, and at one point, very clearly, a voice that did not belong to any of the 6 crew members. A voice that sounded like it was speaking from deep underwater, the words distorted but the meaning clear. It said, "More are coming. The pull is stronger now." I reported the transmission to my supervisor. He listened to the recording and went very pale. He told me to delete it, to forget I had heard it, and to stop digging into the Northern Star incident. When I asked why, he closed his office door and told me something that the Coast Guard does not officially acknowledge. The Northern Star is not the only vessel to have disappeared in that area. Over the past 50 years, 7 ships have gone down within a 10-mile radius of that seamount. All during November, all during storms, and for every one of those vessels, the Coast Guard has received anniversary transmissions. 7 different ships, 7 different crews, all sending Mayday calls on the dates they sank. All describing the same thing. Cold hands pulling them under, the water being full of something that should not be there. My supervisor said the working theory, the one that stays in locked files and is never discussed publicly, is that something lives near that seamount. Something that has learned to create the storms that bring ships down. Something that feeds on whatever it pulls into the deep water. And something that keeps its victims conscious somehow, alive in a state that should not be possible, trapped in the freezing darkness while it feeds slowly over years and decades. He told me to stay away from it, to do my job, log any transmissions I received, but not to investigate further. Then he said something that has kept me awake every night since. He said that operators who become too focused on the transmissions sometimes start appearing in them. Their voices get added to the chorus of the dead, calling for help from a place they have never been, describing sensations they should not be able to feel. 3 Coast Guard communications specialists have disappeared over the past 30 years. All of them worked the overnight shift. All of them had been investigating the Northern Star transmissions. Their bodies were never found, but their voices have been identified in recordings made after their disappearances. Calling for help, describing the cold hands, begging someone to understand that they are still alive down there in the dark. I should have listened. I should have stopped. But last week I received another transmission. This one 9 days before the anniversary. And this time, mixed in with the voices of the Northern Star crew, I heard my own voice. Not current, but future. My voice from somewhere I have not been yet, saying things I have not experienced yet. I was describing the station, my shift, the exact time I would be monitoring the radio on November 23rd. And I was warning myself not to listen, not to try to help, because helping meant becoming part of it. Helping meant the thing in the deep water would know my name, would reach across the distance and pull me down just like it had pulled down the others. But here's the thing I cannot escape, the thing that keeps me coming back to this station every night even though I know I should run. In that transmission, in my own future voice, I could hear something else underneath my words. A coordination, a purpose, as if whatever has those people is learning to use them, to communicate through them, to reach further and further from its territory in the deep water, searching for new voices to add to its collection. Tonight is November 20th, 3 days before the anniversary. I am working my shift alone. The emergency frequency is active, and I can already hear the static building. Underneath it, faint but growing clearer, I hear voices. The Northern Star crew, the other ships, the 3 communication specialists who disappeared, and my own voice, calling from somewhere I have not been yet, telling me exactly when it will happen and exactly how it will feel when the cold hands reach up through the radio waves themselves and pull me down into the place where all those voices live forever. So here's my question for you. If you knew that investigating something, that trying to help or understand something, would cost you everything and trap you in an existence worse than death, would you still do it? Would you let yourself be pulled down just to know the truth? Because in 3 days, I'm going to find out. And if you hear my voice on a recording after that, calling for help from coordinates in the Gulf of Alaska, you will know I found the answer. You will know that some things in the ocean do not just kill you. They keep you, and they are always hungry for more voices to add to their chorus of the drowned.